Workday. Welcome to Drupal Night, sponsored by BioRaft. Tonight we have Tony Savorelli talking about Sass. Take it away, Tony.
So I'm told I can show myself on camera for a second. Hi. So yes, I am, well, that's my full name, but you can call me Tony. I am a Drupal developer at Digital Loom, although I was a freelancer for 14 years. So this is almost all new to me. I have been working with Sass for the past, using Sass for the past, I want to say 4 years, and so every day there's a new discovery, and I'm here to document or to talk about one or two of these discoveries. But first of all, I would like to ask the audience if there's anybody who's never used Sass at all. Okay. Anybody who's never heard of Sass at all? Okay, that's good. So who uses Sass every day, or every week? Interesting. It's going better than I thought. Or yes. Then I have something to say. So Sass is an extension of CSS, meaning that it's software that produces CSS based on something that's really not CSS. At the same time, it's a you can consider that any CSS that you've ever written is good Sass. But what Sass does is to take it's basically a pre-processing layer of CSS. It allows you to do things that with simple CSS you can only dream of, from using variables to declare your colors, your fonts, to nesting selectors so that you don't have to chase them around your style sheets. All this stuff is possible with Sass. So yes, that's a very basic definition of what Sass is. And at the end of this, I will also tell you how to use it, in the sense how to install it, and this is not a practical tutorial about Sass. It's mostly I mostly want to give you an idea of what can be done with Sass and how ultimately it can be useful on your daily Drupal practice, even though you can use Sass without Drupal and Drupal without Sass. So the main feature of, really the most useful feature of Sass is Sass Script, which unfortunately, because this is Keynote, I was not able to uncapitalize that word, so there are a lot of S's there, but I really tried. So the three main features of Sass Script are variables, which, they're variables like in PHP. Functions also, sort of like in PHP, and Mixins. Mixins are probably, if you've never used Sass, they're probably the most unusual kind of thing that you can find, because right now there's only a color declaration here, but really a Mixin can include any kind of CSS block of code, and we'll see more complex ones. Basically, if you have, I don't know, blocks of HTML that need to look the same way, but they don't have, for example, the same class, they're not even the same elements, but you do want them to look the same way, you can enter a bunch of selectors in a bunch of the properties in a selector, turn it into a Mixin, include it in a Sass selector, and voila, all of this will be produced. We'll see code examples in a bit. So when it comes to variables, there are several data types that Sass supports. Some of them are pretty standard, like numbers, strings, And Sass is really not picky when it comes to how you use strings. They can be single or double quoted or just not quoted at all. And normally the recommendation is whenever you expect, or whenever CSS expects for your string to be quoted, quote it. If CSS doesn't expect that, or simply if your string never gets output to CSS, it doesn't really matter if you quote it or not. This will make sense in a bit when we look at some, in a longer bit, when we look at some mixins that I want to show you. Colors. This is probably one of the things. I think it's probably the thing that brought me to Sass in the first place. The ability to declare colors as variables and just reuse them, and not having to basically simply just copy and find and replace colors all across my style sheets. You declare a color once, you use its corresponding variable, and if you want to change that color, it happens because it's magic, I guess. Booleans are booleans and nulls are nulls. It's sort of like a copy and paste from the Sass documentation. I'm not sure why they say nulls. I think nulls should be only one, but it's all pluralized. So. But there are a couple of more data types that are actually my favorite. List of values, which can be separated by spaces or commas. So, for example, if you're declaring margins on a selector, that Sass sees that as regular CSS and it outputs it as regular CSS, but it can also be considered as a list, so you can manipulate that list. You can manipulate that list and have Sass do things to it, and that's pretty neat. Comma separated lists are useful for example, declaring fonts, but not just. But really, the data type that's most exciting. Sorry, I'm not that excited about Sass, but it is exciting when it comes to the kind of stuff that Sass can do. Is maps, which kind of works like an array, and the syntax to manipulate maps is a little wonky. Well, not wonky. It's a little clunky, but it gets the job done, and we'll see an example of how this is used, and I can show you a couple more if we have time at the end. Well, not yet. I want to show you a couple of examples in sort of a, well, that's not supposed to happen. So Sass Script, this is stuff that I've already shown you. Okay, so this is how you declare a mixin. The mixin that I had on the slide was, did I blind anybody? Because I changed the mood here. The mixin that I showed you on the slide was very simple. It was just to show you how to declare it. But this is a little bit more complex. So as you can see, there are properties here that are regular CSS, except for example, color here. It's a regular CSS property, but it's followed by a variable, which was declared up here. So what happens with variables in Sass is that any variable that's declared outside basically outside curly braces, it's considered global. And any variable that's it's considered global, and it can be used across the board. Any variable that's declared inside any curly braces is not. But it can also be globalized by adding exclamation mark global at the end. Yes?
I see two color variables here, Sass color and AwesomeColor.
Yes, AwesomeColor, well, that's actually not a variable.
Oh.
And that's a very good question. And by the way, good thing that you interrupted me because I sometimes might talk too fast and take for granted a lot of things. And so please interrupt me anytime you want, within a reason. When you feel I've reached a period or a semicolon, as it were, you can interrupt me. So yes, the @include AwesomeColor is actually a call of another Mixin. Which I haven't declared here because this is not real code, but I'll show you what happens when I actually use it for real.
Sure. I also just using like dummy variable names for this example, Sass color, AwesomeColor. What would be considered the best practice? To use a real name for the color, saying, Kelly green, or to maybe take a gradient approach, saying this is my mid-value green, my dark green, and my light green,
Right.
so that as you are changing your design, you can easily say, oh, I want to change all dark.
That's a great question. Actually, the Sass color is not a dummy name. It's actually the official Sass color, like this pink here. So that's no, it's fine. It's fine. It was a reasonable assumption to make. And AwesomeColor is actually, you'll see, it's really not what that Mixin spits out is really not awesome. But it's what it is. So the best practice for this, what I normally do is try to be as semantic and as content or visual independent as possible. So I tend not to use real names for colors, because otherwise, if I'm calling a color green, $green and give it a green color, then when I want to change that color to gray, I still have to go through all my style sheets and replace that color name with something else. So I've sort of negate the usefulness of Sass. And so I'd rather have something like functional names for when it comes to especially when it comes to color variables, but also when it comes to font variables. And I would like to. I think that's way beyond the scope of this talk. But if I have time, I can show you what the crazy stuff that I do when it comes to variables. And I've built sort of my own configuration system for Sass, and it's a little nuts. But maybe I have time for that. But yeah, when it comes, so I'd rather be a little bit more semantic. So say main color, or accent color, or background something color, something that will not change in the future. And so if the client says, no, my orange is actually a little less saturated, you can go in and desaturate it in one spot, and everything else will follow in, just by hitting save. Same when it comes to fonts. Consider a website normally has 2 or 3 fonts, then maybe you can have one font called serif, and another one called sans, and another one called icon. And when you change the values of those variables, you've done your job, basically.
Thank you.
So yes, and this is how you declare it, and this is how you apply it, although it was sort of implied by what I said before. For example, if we want to, so our Mixin was called header. If we want to apply it to all the H1 to 6, we simply include header in the as a property, basically. But, and this is what's really fun about this, is that if we have, and this goes back to one of the first few things that I said, if we have another piece of HTML that we need to look like header, of course these are going to be awful headers, so let's never use that. But if you have also, yeah, it's different from the actual example that I have, but never mind. If we have another piece of HTML that we want to look like a header, more or less, with some variations, we can declare it and include header Mixin in its properties. However, this does this takes care of an extra step as well. If we go back to the Mixin declaration here, you can see this bit here, add content. What this does is take whatever I put here between these two curlies and output it within the Mixin itself, within the output of the Mixin. And actually we can, well, the output is here, so I don't even have to go anywhere. So we can see H1 to 6. Sorry, if I go too fast scrolling, just let me know. Because the Mixin was declaring also a nested anchor and the anchor's hover property, you will see that the output takes care of that as well. So we have the headings, their nested links or anchors, and the hover state for those anchors.
So does this work by macro expansion?
Sorry?
Does it work by macro expansion, or is it more of a declarative language?
Is it more of a what?
Is it more of a declarative language, or is it a macro language?
I don't know how to answer that.
Okay.
So I mean, I lack the basic knowledge of that, and maybe I should not be a developer. But if you can expand further on that.
So the one macro expansion language I'm familiar with is,
Yep.
is TeX or LaTeX,
Okay.
where you have some sort of definition, and then when you use the definition, things get expanded. And then things like PHP are more declarative
I see what you mean.
languages where you assign variables and have loops and stuff.
Can I say it's both? Because it kind of sounds like both, but I could be wrong. Maybe we can chat about that later, and maybe my further examples can clarify that for you as well as for me. Here's our pseudo header, which has, well, part of it is what we declared up here, and part of it is what the Mixin spit out. So it also has a nested anchor and the anchor's hover state. So Mixins are very useful. You can do amazing things with them because you can nest Mixins within Mixins and call them one from the other. They have one little problem. Whenever, as you can see from this code here, and I can try to make it a little more, I can't, but you know. They have a little problem. Whenever you include a Mixin within a selector as one selector's declarations or properties, it's going to repeat that code over and over in your style sheet. So here we have this stuff in the headings in the H1 to 6, and we have the same stuff here in the pseudo header. So if it feels like you're saving yourself time by not having to type all of this as, you know, real CSS, so to speak. At the same time, Sass is doing all the work, and yes, you're saving yourself time, but at the same time, your code is still tends to, you know, swell up a little bit. But there are solutions for that. One of these solutions is Placeholder Extensions, which I have somewhere. So here's our, is it visible, legible? So here's our, it's not exactly the same code that I had there because I fixed it for, there was something wrong in there. But there's the AwesomeColor here. This is a bit of a summary of what I've said so far. So this is a function which operates on colors. So here we have a navy color. What this function does is take that color here, lighten it by 20%, and then desaturate it by 5%. Another way, this is one of the things that blew my mind 4 years ago when I started working using Sass, because finally I didn't have to figure out, like, take out a color wheel and try to figure out what colors, and this doesn't mean that you don't have to, you kind of avoid using a color wheel. It's still useful, because if you just play with math, you're going to have a lot of browns in the end. So I don't recommend just going by math. Whatever, if you think that just by flipping a color it's going to be awesome, it's not always, not always. But this is an example of what you can do with colors. You can desaturate them, saturate them, lighten them, darken them, and all that. You can also add one color to another and then use the result. So that's pretty cool. So this is a function, and this Mixin here uses the result of that function to spit out a color for that, for whatever selector we use this on. And this is the selector we're using the AwesomeColor Mixin within the header Mixin, and then these selectors here use the Mixin to produce their own CSS. But as we saw, this is pretty redundant syntax, because as we saw before, this is actually working syntax, and I can show you the AwesomeColor, actually not so awesome color. Let me blow it up. It's not that awesome, I gotta say. But again, that's a pretty good example of what I was saying before. An alternative to not produce bloated syntax is to use extensions. So an extension is, let me find it, because it's there. Nope, not the one. Problem with having small screens is that you never find anything. Here it is. So this is the same code, the same Sass, but instead of declaring Mixins, I declare here two placeholders. In Sass, I'm taking a step back here. In Sass, you can say, if you have, say, an H1 and you want an H2 to look exactly like an H1, you can do something like this. H2, extend H1. And in the output, the H2 is going to include all of the CSS from the H1, no matter what it was declared, within the scope it's in. So if you declare within a media query, it's going to pull it out from that media query and not from. You can't extend selectors that are outside media queries, because otherwise the Sass, it's an explicit decision, because otherwise the code would be extremely bloated, and we don't want that. So okay, that's how to extend a regular selector. This, however, is not a regular selector. This is, and you can do the same with a class or with an ID. This, however, actually, let me show you what happens to that H2 when you do that. Is it that? No, it's this one. Of course, this is stupid because I already have H2 somewhere else, but I don't know what does happen. I think it's let's do something else. Instead of extending this, I think I should have had it somewhere. Let's do something else. All right. So our other header takes up all the CSS. This is the output. It takes up all the CSS that was declared for the pseudo header. As you can see, every time pseudo header appears, other header also appears. But as opposed to what happened when we used a Mixin, if we had used a Mixin here, and actually let's do that, the code would have been way more redundant if we do like this. If we do that, the code becomes a lot more redundant. You see, we go down to line 57, and this is the same exact, ideally the same exact CSS. Not the one I want. Also not the one I want. Here it is. But here, we go down to line 29 or 30 only. So it's like we've, by using extensions rather than Mixins, we've saved like 50% of we have code that's 50% less bulky. Not that it always happens this way. This is just a lucky example. The problem with the main problem with extensions. Before getting to the problems, let's go back to the placeholder. So this is not a class, and it's not an ID, and it's not a regular HTML tag, but it is an extensible placeholder. So if we want to declare some CSS, some properties that do not belong to any specific class, but we want to declare them, for example, because we're building a template for somebody else to use, or for ourselves to use for that matter, something that's flexible enough that can just be plugged in different projects, and we don't want to add classes, because if we added a class here, that class would be reflected directly in the produced CSS. So if I turn this, well, if I do this, the produced a lot more flexible, a lot more dynamic, and you having the ability to use arguments in a Mixin makes a whole world of difference. There's also another very small thing that I like about Mixins versus extensions, and that is this. Let me show you that. Extend. So as you can see, I call my extension, my placeholder selector is up at the top, towards the top of my file. And then down here, my first real, let's call it CSS, is down here at line 30. And that's the body selector. But if you look at the output, what I have first is a bunch of H1, H2, H3, which is funny because in my Sass, those were declared after the body. What happens here is that Sass places all those styles at the spot where at the spot where I declared my header extension. Not a huge deal in most cases, but if you care about code order, if in complex style sheets, that could be an issue of having styles declared after others when you expect them to follow a certain, they are cascading. So this, in my opinion, even though it's a very simple style sheet, it sort of has a tendency to cascade the wrong way. On the other hand, Mixins don't have this problem. Mixins will appear, the result of a Mixin will appear in your CSS at the exact spot where you declared it. The result being of all this, that if we do use the dry technique, or you can brew your own kind, you can have the advantage of the right code order because you're using a Mixin, the advantage of the ability to use, to add arguments to your Mixins, and at the same time, the lean code that can be output only by extensions. Questions for now, and we're approaching the end, I guess. Questions? Did any of that make sense, first of all?
I've got a question about functions specifically.
Okay.
So the one function you demonstrated, you just basically use it to change a value.
Yeah.
Kind of statically. I mean, just
Yeah.
Can functions include any kind of logic, branching?
Yes.
extend? Okay.
You can do all sorts of things. You can have if statements. You can have each statements which iterate through maps and lists.
Okay.
You can have all sorts of stuff. And actually, I mentioned my sort of insane configuration system for Sass. It does exactly that. It basically creates maps of variables rather than what I prefer doing, rather than declaring all variables as globals, is to, because I forget their names mostly. I prefer creating maps of key value pairs, which then are manipulated using a function that I have to make up, but at least. Especially, I find that especially useful when I'm dealing with, coming to Drupal, almost finally, when I deal with, for example, a theme that has a parent theme that has all the functions, and it declares a bunch of variables. When I create the Sass for the child theme, I prefer, instead of cloning all that stuff, I prefer referring to it, and at that point, that's where I need a strong configuration system, really specifically for Sass, to make sure I don't lose my mind, or maybe I lose it more. There was a question there.
Yeah. So, I guess from what I've read, I've learned that people generally tend to stay away from the extend method in Sass. Does the placeholder, I guess, show up in our values? Does that kind of change how you use extends? Do you find yourself using extends more with the placeholder value? I haven't really used the extend too much, mainly just because the general sentiment was not to use extend.
Right.
But so I'm wondering, like, how this, I haven't fully grasped exactly how this placeholder value kind of changes that dynamic.
You mean in the last example with the dry mixin, or with the?
Is it just that you can declare the value without actually writing the actual explicit statement like this is?
Right, exactly. Basically, so when it comes to extends, like pure and simple extends, I don't use them much because of all the issues that I mentioned before, and because I really find it more useful and cleaner in my mind, at least, to go through all those steps. I mean, once I have those two mixins that take care of everything, I'm really all set, and so it's at this point it's part of my routine, I guess. But yeah, going through the dry process it probably takes a little longer to compile, I guess, but
Yeah, we're talking seconds regardless.
yes, yeah.
Actually, I have one other question, and this is not something that you covered, but the default declaration
Yep.
with variables, I've never like fully grasped exactly how that works.
So I have an example right here. So this mixin, let's forget for a second that it does what it does. It doesn't really matter right now. But this mixin uses placeholders, placeholder as a variable, actually placeholders as a variable, which is here. And by declaring it here, I make sure that the first time that Mixin runs, it finds something. So basically, if you have any Sass before this Mixin is called, this specific file actually is called, if you have any Sass that declares that variable, this default will not be considered. However, if nothing declares that variable, at least you have this as a fallback. And that's all there is, really. Yeah. There might be something more. So yeah, well, that's all I just went through. Yes, I sort of mentioned Drupal earlier. this is where I go off on a little rant because when I create a new theme in Drupal, this was very true in Drupal 7. Now I've finally landed on Drupal 8, and I'm trying to be a better man and do things the right way. You know, override all my templates, which is easy. It gets progressively easier, even though it looks different, more difficult, but it's not. I mean, you know, you know. If I really wanted to be a better man, I would also do all the overrides for the core and contrib CSS files, but in Sass. And one of these days, when I'm back from my honeymoon, I will try to. My ideal would be to go in and turn every single style sheet, especially style sheets that come from core, into Sass. For one main reason, that there's a lot of code in Drupal that I don't agree with, and it's getting better. It's getting better, so I won't complain too much. But there's a lot of code that I don't agree with. A lot of code that, for simplicity, is less semantic than it should be. I can show you an example right now in a few seconds. And I would like that code to be sassy enough that I can reuse it in a more semantic, in a more flexible and future-proof way in my themes. And for example, let me close some of these things. Here's one. This is actually the original is here. Oops. Oop. So this is a CSS from Drupal core, CSS file from Drupal core. It's hidden, Drupal 8 core, hidden.modules.css. I can show you, you can find it. I'm sorry, I should have the full path, but I don't. This is what basically controls the visibility of, especially of the visually hidden class. I'm sure somebody else will find it semantic. I don't find it semantic enough because if it's visually hidden, what if I don't want it to be visually hidden? Why should the visually hidden class be in my code? I'm skeptical that that's the right way to go. But in any case, Drupal does that, and so I have to live with it. But I have an idea of what to do, of a way to make it a little more semantic, in the sense that instead of declaring a class that then has to be injected in HTML, I like my HTML to be very, very lean and to use as few classes as possible. But I know that that's not always. I know that the world is split into people who use a lot of classes and people who don't. I'm one of those who don't use a lot of classes, or try not to. So my ideal solution for this would be to declare, in my base theme, say, to declare this Mixin that does exactly the same thing as the visually hidden class does in Drupal core. But actually, let me pull it up somewhere else here. But you know, declaring it using a Mixin makes it reusable and makes me not depend on that class being present in the HTML. And if you want to make it backward compatible, you can do this, and it magically appears as pretty much like it appears. I removed the comments, but it appears pretty much as it would appear on Drupal core, in Drupal core. But that also means that if I want to hide the H2 in all blocks, I don't have to do anything weird. I can just do this. And of course, the block H2 is never going to be in the same file as the visually hidden, but anything that I declare as being visually hidden within the same style sheet is going to be produced in a much more compact and, in my opinion, lean way as well. So this is just a couple words about my conflicted relationship with Sass and Drupal and how to make them. And there's so much more to be said, but I think we're reaching the end of our journey. So there are, and in fact, there are references here to stuff that I haven't even talked about. So that's awesome. References on how to install Sass from the official website. I used to, so Sass at the most basic can be installed as a Ruby gem, which is still something I don't fully understand. And that's the way I used it for a couple of years until I found this guy, CodeKit, which takes care of everything for me. If you're on a Mac, CodeKit is really the way to go, I think, because using visual interface, a graphic interface, allows you to not only deal with Sass in your project, but also with a bunch of other things, including JavaScript minification and all that. It can also, you can also set specific arguments to that affect how the code is produced. You can have different output styles. You can have debug information embedded in the, I can show you, like embedded directly in the style sheet. So for example, here, this would tell me exactly where everything comes from, which is not always, obviously you don't want it in production code, but it can be useful for development. It can run autoprefixer, which is great if you're still stuck with, for example, old ways of declaring border radius. Autoprefixer takes care of that for you because it says you don't need the vendor-specific properties anymore, and it strips them out. You'll eventually learn how to strip them out yourself, but at least you have leaner code to begin with, and all that. And on the Sass website, there's a bunch of other solutions on how to install and use Sass. Great resource for everything Sass, except for the dry stuff. That's something that I read somewhere else, is Dan Cederholm's book on a book apart, in the book apart series, Sass for Web Designers. It's great. It's a great read. You can get through it in a couple hours. And then the article about drying out your Sass that I found back in the day on a list apart. And when it comes to Smacks, I haven't talked about it, so that's all I have. More questions?
I've got another question. Frameworks.
Frameworks, yes, frameworks. That's not a question though.
No, well, I'll ask the question. So I'm the kind of guy who could spend months agonizing over the path not taken.
Yeah.
And I've just started looking at Sass. Now I'm already starting to pre-agonize over what if I want to do a framework? What if I want to move into, looks like you're using Sass Script, but maybe I want to use SUSE, or maybe I want to go with Bourbon, or maybe something better will come along.
Well, Bourbon, so for a while I didn't use Bourbon, and I barely use it now, but I have to. But I say I have to, but it's not a bad thing. I have to, and it's a good thing, because for a while I simply created my own mix-ins for stuff that I discovered that Bourbon does for you, and so go right ahead. Actually, when it comes to using Bourbon in your project, if you use software like CodeKit,
well, I can get to my question now if you want.
Okay then.
So what process of evaluation did you go through to decide I'm going to use, sounds like you maybe were forced to use Bourbon for customer reason or something, or how did you kind of
Job reasons, yes.
How did you kind of settle on one over all the others? It's the same problem people have with, jQuery frameworks. Oh, Bootstrap's great. No, React's the one to go. No, you don't want to do that. You want to use God's.
Do I need to be very honest with you? They told me to. No, it's just the reason, and then I realized that it's the right way to. I mean, it saves you a lot of time trying to figure out how to, like, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and so And also keeping up with a framework like Bourbon, for example, helps you being up to speed with. It gets updated so frequently and it's so precisely that it keeps you up to speed with whatever's going on in browser support and stuff like that. For example, I was trying to use it on an older project to use. There was something about the age of the bourbon that I was age of the bourbon that I was trying to use, and all of a sudden I was trying to produce a flexbox syntax with it, and it did not recognize it for the simple reason that the newer version that I was using simply does not have that anymore, because at this point flexbox is standard enough, mainstream enough that it's weird for me because I still consider it not to be totally mainstream, but it's an indication that things are moving, and so I like that as well. I like the idea that it's through the framework, the use of the framework, that I can learn more things, really. Of course, Compass apparently doesn't exist anymore, so let's not even consider that, but
Compass doesn't exist anymore?
well, I read that it's no longer being developed, so I mean, you can use it, it's just, that's what I read.
You know,
Don't shoot the messenger. I mean, it's still there, it still works. I've used it and it works.
all behind the times, so.
I know, it's, however, again, I have no stakes in the CodeKit on, horse, but this kind of app also allows you to continue using frameworks that, for example, projects that you did like 2 years ago and they used an old version of Bourbon. You don't have to use the latest version necessarily. You can add your own frameworks. You can add your own frameworks in the sense that you have a specific Sass partial that you always use. You just drag it into CodeKit as a framework, as a custom framework, and you don't have to load it into all your projects. Of course, that helps you and not the other people who works on the same projects with you, but that's also an option.
Do you find cases where you have to manhandle the CSS, or does that never happen?
I never manhandle the CSS because not because I respect CSS that much. It's only because if I modify it in 2 minutes, it's gonna be gone anyway. And so the better way would be to manhandle the Sass, and with all your principles, use this mixin rather than this extension, or the other way around. If something works better for you, even if you have to break your own promises to yourself, just change wherever you need to change. The important thing, if I have any final sort of recommendations, is to keep your variables and your mixins and your functions separate from your actual code, if you want to save yourself the trouble of having to really figure out every time why your selectors are duplicated over and over in your CSS files. You don't want that. But yeah. Yes.
So in your example about the visually hidden class,
Yep.
I guess I understand why you would rather have a mixin versus a class so that you can reuse it, but I didn't really understand why you think that class is not semantic to begin with.
Well, I'm not saying that it's completely not semantic. It's just a little semantic-ish in the sense that there's nothing in the HTML that says this has to be visible or not. It's just our decision, and the fact itself that, so that code specifically, and we can go to the actual Drupal comments. Hide elements visually, but keep them available for screen readers. It still means that you value some of your users enough, and that's good that you do, some of your users enough to keep it visible, or not visible, but accessible, literally available to some of them. And so you're saying this is, you know, it goes beyond the being visible or not. Anytime something, which goes back to what I said about colors and about fonts. Calling a color green is not semantic because tomorrow that color might not be green anymore, or for a different project I might need to use that style sheet because it's so awesome, but I will need to change all the color names, and it's going to be, there's always the bastard one that you never find, and especially when you're dealing with sub-themes and stuff like that, there's always that point where you lose track of what, sorry, but I'm
Your point is not, it's not about visually hiding the thing, because there could be other reasons to do that. It's more about, this is available to screen readers.
Yeah, well, in this specific case, yes, it's literally just visually hidden, and so, but yeah, I call it not semantic just because it refers to something that's not integral to the code itself. It's something that's very contextual. So it's visual. It would be visual only because I can see it, but for some other users that might not be the case. And it's like saying this is the left sidebar. What if this sidebar never appears on the left? And I give this thing to a client, and they're like, but why do you call it left sidebar? And Drupal still does that. I mean, in the code, the sidebars are called first and second, and then you go up, and the standard themes are like left and left. But to tell you the whole truth, I recently tried to use a classless theme, and it lasted 2 days. And then after that, I was like, nope, let's go back to at least some amount of classes. At least I want to know what field this is. So yeah, but calling a field, you know, field body is semantic because that's the actual body. So, but again, to go back to the visually hidden, I'm not saying it's completely non-semantic. It's just on the, you know, it's sort of.
And plus, I think it seemed like your main point was more like, instead of having to tack this class on everything, you can use the Mixin and then you don't
Yes.
need this.
Yes, that my main point is that I would also like to be able to, instead of digging through tens of style sheets to finally find where this class is declared, I would like to be able to say, oh, hey, look, Drupal has, or at least there's this theme that I'm using that I probably had to make that uses this Mixin, and I can finally use it. I don't have to worry about how to inject classes into HTML in Drupal 8. Anyone else? Well, I take it as a sign. Well, thank you very much for hearing me blab about CSS or Sass and CSS.